Hello, today we are going to be learning about the Dakota Access Pipeline, but before we begin, let's think back to some previous material that we've covered. So what issues did we find when we examined another text description of the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears? First, we found that there were several areas of concern. So very little information is provided. The account is rather well known, which typically is accompanied by oversimplification. Multiple perspectives are not present and individual narratives are left out. So the problem with this is that there are alternate perspectives that are not considered and that conceal stories of the less dominant groups, which in this case are the Native Americans. And then relating to that, what makes a story a stock, resistance, or concealed story? So we've already touched on this previously, but to review, stock stories are the main stories that we know that are told by the dominant group and typically aren't questioned much. And then concealed stories are those that exist kind of at the same time as stock stories, but are typically overshadowed by the stock story and hidden from the general public's knowledge. And then resistance stories are those of individuals or groups that are rising up against the stock story. And counter stories completely challenge what the stock story is saying. So how does this relate to us today? We can see that, as with the previous topic, the stories that we hear and see and know have a lot more to them than just the one side that we might hear from the stock story. So one specific story that we'll examine in this lesson is the Dakota Access Pipeline. So what is this? It is an oil pipeline in the United States beginning in Stanley, North Dakota and stretching to Patoka, Illinois, and it spans 1,172 miles. The project was announced by Energy Transfer Partners on June 25, 2014 and became commercially operational on June 1, 2017. And the pipeline carries 470,000 barrels of crude oil per day. So what is its purpose? Advocates of the pipeline argue that it's vital to our country for several reasons, including creating new jobs, providing a better and safer way of transporting oil through the nation, boosting the economy through increased taxes, and making America more independent from oil reserves in the Middle East, which would also increase national security. So what is the stock story of this? When one searches Dakota Access Pipeline into Google, the first resource that appears is the Dakota Access Pipeline Facts website. And this website mostly emphasizes the positive aspects of the pipeline and uses superlatives like safest and most efficient, but it doesn't include much about the downsides and disadvantages of the pipeline. And they also have a whole page about the facts, so just discussing misconceptions and other facts about the pipeline. So here are just a few that I chose to highlight. First, the Dakota Access Pipeline is not built on any Native American reservation. The builders adhered to all federal, state, and local laws and regulations. The source of water for the Standing Rock Sioux is not near the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the pipeline is one of the most safest and technologically advanced pipelines ever built. And then here they have just a few charts and maps. So this is from CNN and just shows kind of an overview of where this is going as far as the pipeline goes. And then this is a close-up of the reservation in comparison to the pipeline route. And here we have a few more facts from the Pipeline Facts website, saying that more than 1,000 certificates, permits, and approvals were granted for the pipeline, and there are several other statistics here as well that you can examine. So that is all the stock story. So then what are the dangers of this story? When we only know one source or one side of a story, there's potential for bias, marginalization, or stereotyping. And so by only looking at the facts on this website, we're severely lacking in our knowledge and understanding of the issue because the stock story presented doesn't include the perspective of Native Americans in their facts, and they only state that they're not building on their land. And then this is problematic because this is silencing a whole group of people who are a huge part of our nation and its history. And another danger or an aspect of the danger that we need to consider is this American concept of manifest destiny and thinking that we are entitled to the land that's around us or that we live on, and forgetting that the Native Americans were here before us and we need to be considerate of that. And so that's why it's important to consider concealed and resistance stories as well in this whole issue. So let's look at some of those concealed and resistance stories. So as we saw with our previous study, most stories have more than one side to them, and this is also the case with the Dakota Access Pipeline. So we're going to look at a few of these alternative viewpoints. For concealed stories, the Los Angeles Times had an article published about why few people even knew that the pipeline was being built, and before it became a major issue. So the author explained that because it's a domestic pipeline, typically it's constructed on private land, so there's no overarching permit from the federal government that's required to build, and instead the Army Corps of Engineers becomes the authority on construction. But the issue here is that their approach to assessing the pipelines is to break them into smaller segments and then examine them at smaller specific locations. So they can just look at a specific part of the pipeline, and if everything is good there, then they might think that that is the case with all the other parts of the pipeline, when that may in fact not be the case. And this is also just demonstrating how many people didn't even know that the pipeline was being built, and when they did know, they weren't aware that the federal government didn't require a permit to build that. And then another concealed story is an Earth Justice article, which talks about the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's efforts to resist the construction and operation of the pipeline. And this article includes official reports that explain that the federal permits that were authorized for the construction and operation of the pipeline through the Missouri River violated the law in several aspects. So that's another kind of concealed story where if you look at just the facts on that website, they said that it cleared all those regulations, but that's not the case when we look at this. So then for resistance stories, relating back to that Earth Justice article, that also shows how the Standing Rock Sioux joined Earth Justice to fight against the Army Corps of Engineers, and that shows their resistance to it. And even despite their resistance, pipeline construction still began until almost a year later, when the court finally ruled that the permits that were authorized violated the law. But the court still didn't rule if the pipeline operation should be stopped, so they still continued. And here I included some information about the complaint that they filed, so you can look at that in detail here if you wish to do so. And then for other forms of resistance, the Osity-Sacoan Youth and Allies group formed this relay run in resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline. So the relay began in Standing Rock at the reservation and stretched all the way to Washington, D.C., and the purpose was to gather signatures on a petition resisting the pipeline. So the group was able to collect over 140,000 signatures on their petition, which drew national attention to their resistance. So why is it important for us to examine these stories? Teaching students about this issue in its historical context promotes democratic efficacy and citizenship by teaching students to be mindful of the multiple perspectives which surround an event or situation. So students learn how they can become more informed citizens by conducting research, examining sources for credibility, and exploring diverse perspectives. And then they can also, in examining events such as these, they can be better prepared to face current issues in our society today. So let's look at the connection to the standards. So for Ohio Social Studies standards, I chose grade 5 standard 7, which is about how our physical environment affects human activities and human activities affect the physical environment. So in the case of the pipeline, obviously individuals were affected by this geographic construction that was coming, but then we were also harming the physical environment, so I think that relates directly to each other. And then the grade 8 standard 16 talks about the availability of natural resources, and how sometimes the United States desire for economic and geographic expansion can have unintended environmental consequences, which is basically what we've been finding here with the Standing Rock Sioux, is that there are consequences of their actions and the desires for growth. And then also just that the choices that we make, both individuals, businesses, and also governments, have consequences. So we need to consider the consequences of our actions as we're making choices, and especially in relation to big constructions like this, such as the Dakota Access Pipeline. And then for social justice standards, so I can explain how the way of groups of people are treated today and the way they've been treated in the past shapes their group identity and culture. So this helps students relate to the historical context with the Trail of Tears and Native Americans, because they can think back to how they were treated in the past and then also how they're being treated now with the Dakota Access Pipeline, and use that to make informed decisions. And then kind of going along with that, I'm aware that biased words and behaviors and unjust practices, laws, and institutions limit the rights and freedoms of people based on their identity groups. So that just kind of shows that sometimes people groups are marginalized, and students need to be aware of that. So this going through concealed and resistance stories kind of helps them do that. And then speaking up or taking action when I see unfairness, even if those around me do not. So I think it's important that, especially looking at resistance stories, I want my students to see how others took action and spoke up, and I hope that they're inspired to do the same thing when they see injustice or unfairness. So then let's look at a few instructional examples that relate to this topic, because I think it's important to know how to go about teaching this to students. So for one instructional example, this comes from Native Knowledge 360, which is an excellent resource for Native American history. And this resource begins with a general overview that provides a context for the students, and it defines difficult or unfamiliar words and has pronunciations as well. And then after reading the introduction and getting background knowledge, students begin diving deeper into the topic through discussion questions. So one of these topics, students look at opposing perspectives here. So they're given two different sides of the issue and maps and text about it, and then they have to talk about the differing viewpoints and explain their argument and compare and contrast those arguments and why one is more valid than the other. And then the other two following questions are very similar, comparing and contrasting two different perspectives or kind of gathering more information about the topic. But, then the fourth one is about how a young girl was showing activism and involved in this topic, which I think is very important because it gives students the opportunity to think about how they can be involved in their nation or just their city, anyway, any form of government, basically. And then another instructional example comes from the Zen Education Project, and it's a role play activity. So students are given roles of members of the Standing Rock Sioux, Energy Transfer Partners, Iowa farmers, youth climate change activists, or those benefiting from the construction of the pipeline. And so then students group up with those who have the same roles, and they kind of gather their beliefs and interests and information about that group, and then they answer questions about their beliefs, and then travel around the room, meet other groups, and that allows them to gather information and begin plotting alliances. And then after that, the groups all produce opening statements to give to the entire group, and they explain their side of the argument, and then the classroom is opened up for discussion where most of the learning takes place. And then afterwards, students have the opportunity to follow up on their knowledge and understanding with maps and articles and different sources like that, and they can come back a few days later to share what they've learned. And then here are just a few additional resources that teachers and students can use. And then these are my additional references, and that is all. Thank you.